Okay, so for the final book that I've got out for this particular spotlight session, it's another book that looks at architecture of churches, ecclesiastical architecture, in its context as something that has a purpose, how the architecture can relate to the purpose of the building. And this is an important work. This is a book that was published by Pugin. So Augustus Welby Northmore Pugin, who lived from 1812 to 1852, and he was instrumental in pushing through the neo-Gothic revival in architecture and building in the early Victorian period. So Pugin was born in London. His father had escaped from the French Revolution. He'd moved to London during the time of the Revolution. And his father was a draftsman who was particularly interested in the Gothic style of architecture. And so his son, Pugin, developed this interest and took it further. He was a designer, he was an architect himself, but he's mostly renowned for his kind of passionate evocation of the use of this particular style. In 1836, he published a book known as a book that was entitled Contrasts, which was looking at the then burgeoning neo-Gothic architecture in comparison to the actual Gothic architecture of the later medieval period. And he was contrasting, sometimes somewhat unfairly, he was contrasting the workmanship and sturdiness and excellent design of the medieval originals with what he saw as somewhat shoddy workmanship and ineffectual design and maybe very sort of quick erection of the buildings that were being created in that style at the time. In 1841, he published this book as a follow-up. Now this book is entitled The True Principles of Pointed or Christian Architecture, set forth in 2 lectures delivered at St Mary's, Oscott. So for Pugin, Gothic architecture, the architecture that has the pointed arches on the windows and door frames, was the pinnacle of Christian architecture. It was, and the buildings in themselves displayed, the Christian function of the churches. And this book explains his particular principles, and it gives it talks again about trying to counteract the sort of shoddy design and workmanship of the contemporary craftsman, and it basically encourages contemporary craftsmen to emulate the methods of their medieval forebears if they want to be building architecture which is based on those styles. So Pugin was very well known in his time. He was quite revered. He published various works, mostly looking at this particular style of architecture. After his death, his reputation quickly faded, and this was partly due to the hostility of John Ruskin. So Ruskin obviously was very influential in his ideas and attitudes on art history and pretty much everything else. And he didn't rate Pugin. He didn't think that Pugin was particularly inspired. He also didn't think that Pugin followed through on the ideas that he put out in publication. Now, it was slightly unfair because Pugin only lived to be 40 and Ruskin lived for a very long time after Pugin's death, basically denigrating him. However, his reputation may have suffered in that immediate aftermath of his death, but a number of architects and designers were very influenced by his work, and they took on the principles that he had espoused and created a number of buildings following the designs that Pugin would have liked, and his reputation has risen again in subsequent years. An interesting point on this is that St Mary's, Oscott, St Mary's College in Birmingham, St Mary's College in Oscott, Birmingham, was designed by Pugin. The new building at St Mary's, Oscott, was designed by Pugin in 1838, and it's a Catholic seminary, and this was another slightly controversial aspect of Pugin's life was that he converted to Catholicism, and at a time when, although things were much mellower for people who followed different denominations than the Anglican faith, there was still a lot of kind of prejudice against people who were Catholic. And Pugin's high reputation and standing was quite a boon for people who were fighting for Catholic rights in that early Victorian period. So this in the title page of this book, he's very much setting out his stock as being saying actually in the title of the book that he has delivered these at the college that was founded for teaching Catholic priests. So it's a very nice book. It's rather nicely produced, and it includes a lot of very nice line drawings of parts of churches in the Gothic style. Any particular part of a church or the fittings of a church down to the hinges on the doors and the door handles, there are designs in here for how they should be done according to Pugin's artistic scheme. And it is a very beautiful artistic scheme, quite fancy, quite ostentatious, but the book is very lovely. And we also have a copy in the collection of the follow-up to this book, which looks at the apology for using this style of architecture specifically in Britain. So that's also another interesting book. So there we go. That's a quick run through of some of the bits in the special collections which talk about church architecture, church history, either looking at specific churches, particularly those in the local area, but also more widely, or looking at the role of the church and the principles behind the design of how it was built. So I hope you've enjoyed it. Thank you very much for watching. And next month I should be looking at books with beautiful bindings.